Hello, and thank you for joining us today at our special global event, Reawakening the Social Imagination. I am Ghadah Alharthi, course coordinator, that is Associate Director of the MA Innovation Management at Central St. Martin's. In this event that I will be chairing, our speakers will share with us their thoughts on how can we collectively reimagine society, implement a range of strategic experiments, and take creative action on an unprecedented scale. We are pleased how the idea of this event came about, semi-serendipitously through successive conversations between our course leader and director Tuukka Toivonen, Jeremy Till, Geoff Mulgan, and Juha Leppänen. Social imagination resonates so strongly with us as a community at MA Innovation Management. In our dynamic MA course, which is all about creativity, entrepreneurship, innovation, and social impact, our students have been working on many creative projects, including the Uncertainty Project, where they are envisioning the future of the city. And there is amazing work by our students, which will be shown in an exhibition this May with the London Transportation Museum. We are also excited to announce that we have a budding collaboration with Demos Untitled Community, where our students are working on something very exciting, on imagining the future of cities. Untitled is a global alliance which includes over 40 members. It aims to reimagine the central institutions of our society and to experiment on how to rebuild them. Our course values and mission really resonates with what the Untitled is doing, bringing imagination and creative methods to rethinking social structure, poverty, the environment, and the impact of artistic practices and more. We are keen to do our bit at MAME CSM and UAL to give space for the exciting vision of proactively imagining a better tomorrow that is embedded in Untitled and that makes it so directly relevant from the perspective of our learning community. And today we have with us Professor Jeremy Till, Head of Central St. Martin's and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts. He is an architect, educator, and writer. His research focuses on the political, social, and environmental dimensions of spatial production. His extensive written work includes flexible housing, architecture depends, and spatial agency. We also have Juha Leppänen, Chief Executive of Demos Helsinki, leading independent Nordic think tank. Juha has led multiple strategy foresight and innovation processes for both public and private institutions. Currently, Juha sits in the board of directors of multiple organizations and is an active advisor on strategy, policy, and behavior change issues and serves as a Royal Society of Arts Fellow. Last but not least, Geoff Mulgan, a professor of collective intelligence, public policy, and social innovation at University College London, UCL. He is a fellow at Demos Helsinki and is co-lead of the International Public Policy Observatory on COVID at UCL. Prior to that, he was chief executive of Nesta, the UK's innovation foundation. It is a pleasure to have you all here with us today, and I will hand it over to Jeremy now to give you a note. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm feeling a bit rubbish as head of Central St. Martin's that I haven't got Ghadah's backdrop because that's much more official than mine. Anyway, I'm really delighted to do a short introduction to this event because it chimes so well with both my personal research interests, but also the collective identity and direction of Central St. Martin's. So it's clear that we are facing a set of intersecting conditions, which let's call them crises, because I think many of them are. The crisis of the climate emergency, the crisis of racial justice, the crisis of democracy as played out yesterday in Parliament, the crisis of a blindness to humanity when we see genocides going on and humanitarian crises in places like Yemen. And put simply, I think that many of these crises we can lay at the door of the modern project which can be defined as addicted to progress, to growth, and using the methods of order and reason as its motors. And in many ways, in the research project I'm doing at the moment, I'm arguing that these conditions of the modern project are the way in which these various intersecting crises have been caused. And it's clear that the ways of thinking and the methods of the modern project are not going to solve the issues and problems caused by the modern project. Or in Audre Lorde's famous dictum, which always needs to be repeated in my book, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so we need to have other ways of thinking through the crises that the modern project has presented us with. And I would argue, of course, as head of St. Martin's, that many of those ways of thinking are inherent in everything that we do. In that we now no longer talk about design as problem solving, but design as sense making. We talk about the way that the creative mind is a contingent mind and therefore is not set on particular kind of goal-orientated outcomes and so on and so forth. But most of all, we talk about the imagination. And in this, I turn to a fantastic book called The Great Derangement by the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh, in which he berates his fellow novelists for not taking on board the issues that are confronting us. And he writes, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus a crisis of imagination. And the imagination therefore becomes, for me, and I think for the panel and for the course and for the college as a whole, a primary vehicle and means of transmission by which we can address these intersecting crises of the modern project. And just, I'm sure that our two speakers will talk about this, but the imagination is not a flight of fancy. It is not an unbounded place of uncertainty. It always comes from embodied human experience. And where the technocratic aspects of the modern project abstract and remove us from human experience, the imagination allows us to think through as embodied, environmental and ethical humans about how we might address the crises that are in front of us. And with that, I will hand over to Geoff Mulgan for his presentation. But thank you for coming, and thank you to our two speakers in particular for opening up this important debate.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks for the invitation to be with you. Because CSM people are very visual, I'm going to spare you looking at my face and share some pictures to help sort of guide our discussion, which, as Jeremy said, is about, to me, how do we amplify our shared imagination, see what could be possible 20, 30 years into the future and make it happen. In a sense, that the starting point, I think, of this discussion is the thing which Juha helped begin about a year ago with the launch of the Untitled project. And I wrote for them a piece on the imaginary crisis, which I thought was a crisis of lack of imagination rather than that the crisis was imaginary. And since then, there's been a lot of work trying to flesh out the thinking, the options and so on. I'll just give you a rapid fire flavor of all of that. And in some ways, the starting point is awareness of the gravity of the climate crisis. But for me, I was very struck a year or so ago talking to many of the people involved in the Friday school strikes who had such a clear picture in their heads of what could go wrong. Very little optimism that the world could be better than it is today. The best they could hope for was to avert catastrophe. And in a way, this opened up the question, why has that, well, sort of the optimism, the confidence, the view of a possibility of progress disappeared so much? You see this in popular culture, which is far better at showing apocalypse and disaster than anything very desirable in the future. And to the extent we do have a picture of the future, it tends to be very technological without much place for humans in the sort of smart city visions, or it's dystopian, it's yet another surge of data being collected from our brains, robots taking our jobs, and so on. And a lot of money is spent on the technological imaginary, but much less is done on the social imaginary. And you can see one of the effects of that in how people think about the future. There are many polls showing roughly the same pattern as this, which is that if you ask adults whether their children will be better off or worse off than them, big majorities in many countries expect their children to be worse off. In the UK, it's the 70 to 23 expect worse to better. France, even worse, 80 to 15. And this is actually probably, we don't have very strong data, but this is probably the first time in several hundred years this has been the case, that there's been such a loss of belief in the possibility of progress and improvement, at least in Europe and North America. It's slightly different in other parts of the world. Now, that then leads to this question, well, what can we do about it? How can we give people things to hope for, to believe in, to imagine? And one of the things I've been doing over the last year or two is looking at what we can learn from the past, from past attempts to think into the future. And I think they are, in some ways, that they're useful, both for what their good sides and their bad sides. So, for example, there's a very long tradition of thinking about utopias, pure utopian thinking, from Plato to Thomas More, Francis Bacon. On the bottom left, there is Edward Bellamy, whose book, Looking Backward, was, I think when it came out, the third bestseller ever in American history. It was a socialist vision, which included home deliveries, credit cards, all sorts of things. And 60 years ago or so, Ursula Le Guin published The Dispossessed, which had a very clear semi-anarchic vision of utopia on the planet Anares. In some ways, what's really surprising is that since then, and Marge Piercy and a few others in the early 70s, there have been almost no utopias, and certainly none reaching a mass audience. It's as if for half a century, pretty much, that whole way of thinking has disappeared from our culture. The other sort of source of things in the past was generative ideas, an idea which then could lead to many other things. So the idea of human rights, which slowly evolved over 200 or 300 years, was embodied in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that's Eleanor Roosevelt there, and then extended to rights around gender and sexuality and animal rights and all sorts of things. That's an incredibly potent generative idea. Ideas like the idea of universal free health services is still one which doesn't exist in most of the world. And ideas like the circular economy, 15 years ago adopted by the Chinese Communist Party in its Congress, that is still a very generative idea, which leads to all sorts of new ways of organizing a society, economy, our own homes, and so on. There's an interesting history of places which tried to sort of show the way to the future. Up the top left there, you'll see New Lanark in Scotland, where Robert Owen created a cooperative, factories and schools and communities, and in a way had enormous influence across the world. I think there's 300 million people now working in co-ops, but it was shown through reality, not through writing books about it, but through demonstration. And on the bottom right is Auroville in South India, a very different attempt at a prefigurative community of a different, really spiritual relationship with the universe. And there's a sort of practical side of that too in the tradition of model towns and cities. Some wildly utopian ones, like at the top left, the Ikari communities. In the middle right are the garden cities invented by a British anarchist, Ebenezer Howard, and they spread all over the world as a new vision of living as an alternative to the dirty, crowded, unpleasant cities of the time. Bottom right is Freiburg in Germany, perhaps one of Europe's leading eco-cities with very different ways of organizing daily life and waste and energy and transport, and again showing by example, quite puritanical, in some ways quite constricting. Some people don't like it at all. It's not all that liberal, but it is one vision of a possible net zero future. And I put on the bottom left there an advertising picture from Google's attempt to turn Toronto, through its Sidewalk Labs project, into a model city of the future smart city, enabled by data and lampposts with sensors and so on. Now that had a lot of money spent on it and was essentially rejected by the people of Toronto almost exactly a year ago. And they basically said, we don't want that vision of a corporate data-driven future. And more recently in Portland, there was a similar failure. So this is a fascinating space of people trying through reality, through design on the ground, to show possible routes to the future and embodying imagination in buildings and parks and roads and so on. My family comes from New Zealand, so I have to say something about pioneer nations, nations which in some ways taken it on themselves to be agents of amplified imagination. New Zealand was the first country in the world where women won the vote, a long way ahead of countries like the US. Also built one of the world's first welfare states in the 20s and 30s, and more recently has been pioneering things like integrating well-being into policy. There you'll see the well-being budget of Jacinda Ardern's a couple of years ago now, and fascinating experiments giving legal personhood to rivers and national parks, turning the environment into, as it were, a citizen with some sovereignty. And there are many, many other ideas of this kind where it's often the small countries like Finland or Iceland or New Zealand act as pioneers, think and imagine in ways which perhaps are harder in big old countries like ours. So I hope that gives you a flavor of some of the ways in which imagination is working. And I wanted to say one example of where I think, which proves why we need this imagination most. Today, we've just been having announcements on R&D spend in the UK. I've been fascinated for the last 2 years on this evidence from the World Happiness Report, which shows the world's happiest countries like Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland. What explains their relative happiness is not their GDP or even their life expectancy. The strongest predictor is answers to this question: if you are in trouble, do you have relatives or friends you can count on? And that's become a really important issue in the last 12 months through the COVID crisis all over the world. But no government I'm aware of, no R&D funder spends anything on this, the most important question. So we have lots of imagination on nanotechnology or new aeroplanes, but not on the things which matter most to our well-being as people. I say the Finlands and New Zealands are addressing this more seriously, but it's almost invisible in the recent statements from the UK government. So I've been looking as well at the methods. What are the methods you can use to spark imagination? And there are many of them, and they're actually fascinating, from world building methods used in Hollywood to create coherence of sci-fi pictures, futures literacy, backcasting. You try and picture a possible future and work backwards, speculative design, speculative fiction, ways of using dreams, psychodramas. I won't go through all of these, but there's a fascinating sort of landscape of method, some of which then have institutional form. Finland, again, has long had a committee of the future in its parliament. Wales has a future generations commissioner. Bologna, a civic imagination office. Singapore, a strong strategic foresight team. The UAE, a ministry of possibilities, and so on. So there are lots of ways you can try and become more systematic in doing this sort of work. It doesn't have to be just people dreaming up ideas at random. And I've long used a set of, well, I think are quite generic creativity tools, where you take a topic, which could be isolation or childcare or anything like that, and you systematically work through applying these almost heuristics to it. What happens if you invert roles? Let's say, patients become doctors or learners become teachers. What if you integrate diverse things together in ways they haven't done before? What if you extend existing ideas like the circular economy, but to something completely different? And using these tools pretty quickly, almost any group can get a much wider menu of possibilities and often surprise themselves with their own creativity. Not much used in our political parties, I'm afraid. So in my last 3 or 4 minutes, I was going to give you a flavor of some of the domains where I think this imagination is happening, which we need more of. An obvious one is really accelerating moving cities to become net zero. Copenhagen's committed to be net zero by 2025. What would it really take to speed that up on everything from food to daily travel to energy, etc.? There is a lot of momentum there, but there's some crucial missing bits as well. What if all investment was judged not just by financial return, but by social and ecological impact? Here, there's some positive long-term trends. ESG reporting in the US, the biggest funds of capital on the planet, which you may not be able to see there, Norway, Japan, and so on, are trying to integrate ecological considerations into their money allocation. And the Pope has become a great advocate of this, perhaps the most successful ever advocate for a slightly different way of thinking about capitalism and its imagination. Jeremy mentioned democracy. What if we really redesigned it for now, rather than as in America for the 18th century, or in Britain, probably the late 19th century, most of our forms we use in Parliament. And countries like Taiwan show the way. They've used hacker mentalities, digital mentalities, collective intelligence thinking to redesign how democracy works, how a parliament makes decisions. And when you see it in practice, you think, why on earth is this not obvious? And yet, of course, our incumbents simply don't think like that. What if spreading lies and falsehoods became actually illegal? So it's good there's at least pressure now on the Twitters and Facebooks not to be quite so significant as spreaders of misinformation, disinformation, etc. But we're still a very long way, I think, from these wholes of knowledge ecosystems we depend on becoming positive and useful, and not becoming the problem rather than the solution. My own view is the law needs to be brought in there. And that's a bit of social imagination. What if our welfare systems were radically transformed to address precarious workforces, old age insecurity, mental health, all the things we know should be addressed by welfare? And here, the fact that there have been quite large experiments on universal basic income in the US, in Finland, in Kenya, many countries, showing very interesting results in terms of positive effects on work, positive effects on anxiety. This is exactly how we should reimagine, have an idea, but then try it out in practice, see what actually happens, rather than trying it out on a whole population at once. What if we expanded the role of the commons as a way of organizing things? And I've been quite involved in some of this work, knowledge commons, data commons, land commons, some of the global commons like satellite orbits, take you to a quite different picture of how the world, its economy, its public goods could be organized in the future. What do we found creative ways to use liberated time? We're still in seeing, though some people don't experience it, but a very long run downward trend in working hours. Life expectancy is going up, and that means billions and billions of hours being freed up. Is that just to watch ever more Netflix series, or does it create a new way of organizing community, the arts, social action? I think this is a fantastic opportunity we have in the decades ahead, which needs imagination to work out how best to organize that time. What if our education systems weren't just doing knowledge transfer, which is what our Minister of Education believes they should be doing, but actually focusing on what we know already will be the key skills of this century, including ideas, creativity, thinking in systems, complex problem solving, and so on. This takes you to a very different imagination of what a school should be, or a university, or lifelong learning. So, and a final one is in terms of global platforms. One of my areas of work at the moment is these things like IPBES, which is the biodiversity global platform, which tries to organize global knowledge on what to do, what is or isn't working. I think there's a whole series of new global collective intelligence platforms we need of this kind, as we had with the IPCC on climate change, IPBES, and a few others. So to end, this is quite a famous quote from Oscar Wilde. A map of the world that doesn't include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. We need some utopian thinking. We need some bolder thinking which jumps a generation ahead to guide our experiments, our actions now in the present. And I think if we lose that, as I think we have lost it, actually it leads to a sort of malaise, a lost energy, a lost possibility, which is really unhealthy for societies in every way. So I hope that's a bit of starting point for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. There's a lot to unpack there, and we look forward to doing that during our conversation later. And I encourage our audience to submit their questions for our speakers in the chat box. But first, we will hear from our second speaker today, Juha. The floor is yours.
Hello, and many thanks, Ghadah, and many thanks, Geoff, for an excellent presentation, and best greetings from Helsinki, Finland. I will just quickly put the slides on. Can you see it? Yes, excellent. So yes, thank you for the excellent presentation for Geoff, who's also been a source of inspiration behind the Untitled initiative. Before going in depth into the initiative, a couple of words in terms of background and in terms of premise behind this, this agenda. First of all, this is personally an important initiative to myself. For the past 10 years, I've been working with quite a few of those methods for imagination that Geoff was pointing to, in terms of backcasting, in terms of producing narratives for social imagination to emerge with different actors, whether governments, whether private actors, whether communities and individuals. And I've come to realize that we do need a focused arena for social imagination. And from that premise, then we started to think what Untitled could look like and what that type of an arena would look like in practice. And the reason for that is very simple, and it is exactly where Geoff left out with. If we're not able to create a narrative that is utopian, inspirational, a source of desirable future that increases demand from people around the world, there is little to be expected in terms of successes towards getting to such future. So there is a clear demand, and for that demand, we've started to build the Untitled initiative. There's been one single design principle behind the work, which is the principle of openness. And openness on two different domains. First, conceptually. As you all know, there are quite a few different words, notions, ideas, and agendas in terms of how the future should look like. In the end, that doesn't really matter. So that's why we've called it Untitled. Let's figure out how it should look like. Let's figure out what the vocabulary should be. Secondly, a more practical openness. It makes no sense for any organization to own such an initiative. Instead, it should be as open and transparent as possible. So for that reason, essentially the thinking behind is that at Demos Helsinki, we launched the Untitled. We're so far coordinating the Untitled, but already we are seeing some of the working streams being created by our partners around the world. For instance, Life Itself in France, which is remarkable because that's exactly how such initiatives should move forward in practice. A disclaimer before I go into practicalities, which is that this is essentially the beginning of the year 2 of hopefully the Untitled decade. So there's much more work to be needed, but I'll try to give you a glimpse of where we are. So in terms of, again, what Geoff was also referring to, a lot of the vocabulary and words we use in ways through which we believe that they've always existed in our lexicon. So a lot of that we have, a lot of how we live is something that we believe to be foundational in our societies. Yet in practice, one narrative of the past 300 years could be that essentially through imagination, through struggle, through experimentation, we've come to a place in which we have the societies in which we live. The challenge that we're facing is that now we don't have 300 years. Due to a variety of crises we're facing in the 21st century, this cycle, a process of imagination, struggle, experimentation needs to happen much more rapidly. So in the next 10 years, we need to be able to figure out a future that is desirable enough for people to really start believing in it. Then if we take a bit of a look into the situation where we are, as described by Jeremy and Geoff, there is a real danger of a collapse in many crucial social systems. We know that many of the mainstream narratives that were bound to give us essentially a way forward have lost relevance. An outcome of this loss of relevance is essentially that many organizations are virtually purposeless. And this sense of purposeness might, in the worst case, lead into a sense of loss of hope. And if we are losing hope, we're essentially losing the potential to move forward. So, as we all know, hope is always a key ingredient in change. We need to be able to see, but also believe that there are worthwhile alternatives and futures in order for us to engage with action. We need hope to motivate and align our actions as organizations, but also as societies. That is needed now more than ever. Then if we take a bit of a look and try to have a diagnostics of the situation in which we are. So there are a multitude of crises and transformations at hand, and there are multiple of titles for such transformations as well. Some call it crisis of capitalism, some talk about decarbonization, there's the digital transformation, there's the ecosystem collapse, all of these happening at the same time. in parallel to each other. And what is the risk of thinking of these transformations and crises in parallel, separate from each other, is that we don't essentially realize that there is also the opportunity when we look at these together. So fundamentally, if we look at the transformations that are happening at once, there is an opportunity that we might also realize that by basically looking at them collectively, looking at these transformations together, we have an opportunity to imagine what the society could be in radically different terms than through any single vertical. So this is essentially the opportunity, and this is the opportunity to which we started to design the Untitled initiative on top. So to consciously but yet radically transform a society, we need to engage with two sides of conscious change. One is the side of imagination, and the other is the side of experimentation. And why these two together? Imagination is needed for us to be able to create those utopias, create those desirable futures that we want to expect for, that we want to fight for. So this is clear, and this has been stated very well already before. But we also need experimentation, because if we only move forward with imagination and reimagining the society, it might feel that it's too far. It might not feel tangible enough. We might not understand to what to work for and what to fight for as well. So the dialectic between imagination and experimentation in something in which we believe a new method and process should be created. And this is exactly what we tried to do with the Untitled. What Untitled essentially is, it is an unlikely alliance of activist organizations across sectors and around the world. You can see the current list, and this list is growing every month. So the idea is to bring together as many actors from around the world as we can in order for us to engage with unlikely alliances, in order to engage experiments that illustrate the potential for the desirable future that is imagined. And here, for instance, having actors that look at different contexts, for instance, the context of cities from different perspectives, is important, because then we can basically get the thesis and antithesis and create a synthesis. So try to create a dialogue in which we can formulate something that makes sense and is something that can be experimented with. For instance, there's quite a few organizations working on future of work and looking at that topic from uniquely different perspectives. And those dialogues have been the most fruitful I've heard in the context of Untitled. Then, in terms of the theory of change, essentially what we believe in is that one needs to have a narrative, one needs to be able to imagine a narrative of a fair, just, and joyful transformation of a society. It needs to be something that is tangible enough. It needs to have, in a way, flesh around it. It needs to feel aspirational to a variety of different people around the world. Yet at the same time, a narrative and building the narrative requires a process. And this is the method of Untitled. So essentially what we have in the Untitled community is we have committed people, and we have different items in terms of agenda, different initiatives, for instance, initiatives on data rights, or what does the future of urban, regenerative urban environments look like. And then in the end, we also have experimentation ideas, practical ideas that we can push forward. So those are the elements that we have. Then the Untitled is essentially the cycle that puts these elements together through art and imagination, through dialogue and conversation, and through experimentation planning. And it happens through different events, different vehicles throughout the year. We have different meetings in order to dig deeper into specific topics and agendas. We have experimentation clinics to help and support unlikely alliances to put those experiments together, to design the experiments, to launch the experiments. And we have an annual festival to celebrate the future in ways through which we bring different forms of art, different forms of design, different forms to engage and really feel what the reimagined future could actually be. So this is the machinery of the Untitled. And then in terms of outputs, what we'll get and what we now start to see from the first year, we see unlikely alliances forming on different topics, coming together in terms of debate, in terms of of formulating a synthesis of a topic. We see experiments emerging, experiments that we are now actually right now starting to convert into practical ones. And we see publications. So for instance, on the Untitled website, there's the publication from the first festival that happened in Helsinki, September last year. And with this, our hope and goal is to be able to portray a narrative of a just, sustainable, and joyful transformation of the society throughout this decade. So this, in a nutshell, is the process and method of Untitled on an outline scale. So to sum it up, Untitled is an unlikely alliance formed to collectively reimagine the society, set the agenda for the most important experiments, and help to execute them together. Through having committed people, agenda items, and experimentation ideas, through having a flow of activities that is supported by the members and created and held by Demos Helsinki, by having the outputs of alliances, experiments, and publications in order for us to devise together what the end result as an imagined future could look like. I'll show you a glimpse of the imagined future from the September's annual festival, which is essentially here. So what we did there during 2 days was a series of events and discussions and debates, formulations of different experimentation ideas in different fields and domains. So for instance, on data ownership, which are the key metaphors there, moving from ownership to control, from valuing nature, which are the ownership mechanisms and processes for us to be able to separate private ownership from common assets, from what should inclusive digital governance look like, which are the key questions in fair transitions. We had a lot of discussions on future of urban spaces, essentially about the fact that the most sustainable building in the world is the one that we've never built and will never be built. Walking the path from linear to circular in not just material use, but in a variety of different domains and sectors of everyday life. So a variety of different themes through which we went then deeper into in separate streams and started to work on experiments to make them more tangible and practical. And I'll show you an example of an experiment that emerged from the festival in September last year. With the biggest service union in Finland, PAM, which is a labor union for service sector workers here nationally. Essentially, we started to formulate an experiment in which the collective bargaining power of the employees in, for instance, different service sector working places could be used to drive the decarbonization targets of the employers. So essentially trying to convert the collective bargaining power that can be pursued by the union into something through which we can secure better decarbonization goals for the employers. And this, of course, has the additional benefit for the sense of purpose and meaning for the employees. So when the employees in those workplaces are able to pursue goals that are collective, that are societal, that relate to our climate targets, it also hopefully through this experiment illustrates an increase in the sense of meaning in whatever they do in the everyday work. So this is an example. There were many more. And this year, the goal is essentially to focus on much more building new experiments. So naturally, we will continue building new narratives, but the focus will be on experimentation and the process and the method of experimentation. So how to convert those new imaginations, those areas that Geoff was pointing out in his presentation, into the domains of the society in which we need to see utopias, into radical experiments through the unlikely alliances we have so far at the Untitled community. And then, of course, finally celebrating the future and the desirable future at the Untitled Festival. So before I end, a final note. Successful transformation of foundational institutions, as said, it requires both imagination and experimentation for us to be able to both showcase a desirable future, but also showcase the way towards it in a tangible fashion. Most importantly, that transformation requires every one of us. And in case you're interested to participate in one way or another, do stay tuned. Untitled Community is a way to figure out how you can connect, how you can engage. I'd be very, very happy to see you all there. So many thanks for this, and I hope we'll be having a great dialogue next. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for your presentations, especially for bringing on a larger view of what we're going through and what needs to be done. To kick off this dialogue segment of today's proceedings, Juha and Geoff, could you speak a bit more about the strategy behind Untitled and how you aim to drive change through it? You've said before in your discussions with Tuka that yours is an open strategy that puts less emphasis on branding, labeling, and owning this initiative, and more focus on sharing and scaling impact, as well as longer-term views. We're interested to know what actionable lessons might exist here for diverse Untitled participants and others who wish to build similar creative moments. We're also interested in how we could maximize synergies between movements like Untitled and our own academic communities.
Many thanks. If I'll start, and then most likely Geoff can complement. From my perspective, like what is lacking is that it's not the lack of supply in a way. There's quite a bit of ideas. There's quite a bit of analysis. But what we've tried to do with the Untitled is essentially to create that interface with the demand side as well. So to create aspirational futures and senses through which people can actually drive towards those ideas, want the ideas, engage, and be a movement around those ideas. And if that is the goal, then it has to be open. It has to be as open as possible, because essentially that will never happen by one single entity, any single organization, any single group of people even. So Untitled for sure won't be the only initiative in this space. There will be multiple others. And what I've seen in the past decades is essentially a situation in which a lot of organizations are doing their own initiatives, trying to enforce and coin their own ideas and make those into actionable ones. And I feel this is fundamentally the wrong approach. We don't have time for that. So it has to be as transparent and open and networked as possible, which basically means that it requires quite a bit of trust. So in the first year, we just basically focused on building the community of actors and individuals, because you need to have the core group in any initiative. Now we're essentially putting our focus in the process and method, because we need to get tangible experiments through essentially fulfilling the promise of unlikely alliances, building experiments. I feel there is that engagement towards those. But then from there, we'll start opening it up even more. So any initiatives that you have, any networks that you have, we're more than happy. And I'm very happy that we already have now one concrete one coming up in terms of collaborations. And this is really a sincere open invite. If anyone wants to take hold of any of the Untitled working streams, we're more than happy to discuss how we can make that happen.
Well, I can weigh in on this. So in a way, what Juha and his team are doing is a very open invitation, and it's up to anyone on this call whether you take that up, and that is to become part of the community. And it's a community where I think there's a problem, though, both on the supply and the demand side. Maybe I can slightly disagree with Juha. So on the supply side, let's say you are a city wanting something radical in welfare or housing or whatever. Actually, the menu of really well thought through options for you to act on is usually pretty thin. So there's usually work to be done by people in turning what's a promising idea into an idea which really could be experimental, which is thought through its dynamics. And then on the demand side, we need to encourage mayors, ministers, political parties, businesses, big NGOs to want to be more hungry for ideas. And some cities, for example, are very hungry, others not at all. So I think Untitled doesn't have a precise sort of plan of exactly how it's going to change things. That's not how the world works, but it's creating a space which hopefully both galvanizes more, better, more inclusive, more open supply of fantastic ideas and imagination, but also helps build the confidence of the users, the implementers, that it's worth actually trying out and experiment in eliminating homelessness or universal basic income, or getting rid of all the city centre roads and turning them over to pedestrians, and a million other examples of that kind.
Thank you. Now, Geoff, you write in your paper on the imaginary crisis, which members of our main community team, they've read it this term. And just recently, one of our students said, and I quote, "It is extremely capturing on many levels." And you wrote in that paper that a healthy ecosystem of social imagination needs to combine speculative discovery with analytic intelligence and experimentation. Now, is this all about opening up more spaces for social imagining and collaboration between creatives, scientists, and various analysts? And how do we build a thriving ecosystem of such spaces and committed collaborations?
Okay, well, that is a big question. I've actually now extended that to book length, and I'll try not to speak at book length now. So there's one set of messages for universities and academia. And in fact, I did quite a long follow-up paper, what I call exploratory social sciences. So how can universities be much more systematically working in this space of imagination, mapping out, again, possible futures for school systems or health or policing or justice, linking together creative methods, consciously using the best ideas from the arts and design and so on, but then adding in rigorous analysis, quantitative methods, and a sense of a political reality of what the public will buy. And weirdly, that space has almost disappeared from universities all over the world. It's very hard to do that kind of work. It's not funded, it's not rewarded. And I believe we need a much more energetic approach to exploration in our universities, which are full of lots of brain power. There's then a sort of different issue for government. And I want governments to be much more consciously experimental, as some are, Finland to a degree, Canada, a few others. So their job is not to design a policy for the whole country, and as I said earlier, just impose it. The best way of doing government now is you have a good idea, you try it out, you improve it through learned experience, as the best businesses do in design or in digital. And that's a quite different mindset. In my last role at Nesta, we ran lots of these experiments with governments around the world and produced a whole sort of framework of methods of how to design and run experiments. It's still not mainstream though, and yet in a way that's crucial to have the demand space, so that if someone, again on this call, has a fantastic idea, there's a way in which it can be tried out in reality quite quickly, hopefully at relatively low risk, rather than doing, as I say, what most governments still do, which is try out new ideas on their whole country at once. And nearly always they go horribly wrong because they haven't been done experimentally. So I think what works in medicine, in vaccines, what works in software actually is also needed in politics and governance too. And then I also, there's other roles for philanthropy and physical spaces and so on. There's probably not time to go into. But I think to have an ecosystem of imagination, it's just like having an ecosystem of dance or theatre or the visual arts. It's lots of elements come together, really good practitioners, funding, spaces, audiences who really know what's good and what's bad, critics, arguments. We need exactly the equivalent for our social imagination.
Thank you, Geoff. And you, what are your thoughts on a healthy ecosystem of social imagination? I mean, clearly, there remains a significant challenge in connecting higher level systematic futures thinking with lower level practical action. And we need to explore something new. We need to go forward from here, and not only on a micro level, but on a macro level as well. So how can we provide a way through in which government is capable of both imagining new policies, but doing it in a systematic way?
This is a really, really good question, a question that we've been actually working quite a bit with in the past 6 years, mainly with our government here in Finland, but with other governments as well. So in a way, I think there's some recognition on government side for two things. One is that necessity to engage with a wider ecosystem of actors to come up with initiatives and solutions. and the other is to essentially have a way through which one can test and experiment with initiatives before mainstreaming those initiatives. And we've been working on those methods here. So from the government's perspective, I think it is a bit of a lack of method. I think there is that lack of will. For instance, if I look at the politicians we have here in our cabinet. But in terms of lack of method, what we basically need to do is to combine different innovation methods that I'm sure you've been working with a lot in the past as well, and try to structure those into the core government mechanisms such as policy making and policy design tools. So here, what that meant in practice, back in 2015, we worked with our government to establish an experimentalist framework in our government. And under that framework, then, for instance, our universal basic income experiment was launched. So if there is that capability for experimentation and really connecting with new ideas within our governance systems, then those systems might even explore initiatives such as the universal basic income. So I think that's the gap there, but of course it's a super wide question and one can engage with that from a variety of different perspectives, but I see that as the biggest gap in terms of connecting those ecosystems together.
Thank you, Juha. So now, what can design and art schools do, not only to catalyze the social imagination, but to connect it to impactful outcomes and transformation in the real world? Or to rephrase the question, how can we work to overcome the gap between imaginative rhetoric and transformative change? And on a related note, do innovation management and strategic design courses have a special role to play as an intermediary or catalyst in this process?
Well, I would throw that question back to you, of course, but maybe let me give you an example where I think we would really benefit from your methods and your skills. And it's one I'm working on a lot at the moment, which is mental health. So we have a bit of a mental health crisis. We did anyway, but particularly because of COVID-19, really seriously affecting teenagers, and the International Public Policy Observatory, which I'm helping run, has been doing a lot on that. We've got another event tomorrow on it, but also mental health amongst the frail elderly in residential care homes. Now, I would always throw back to your students, what can you do to help us better understand the often very complex patterns of mental ill health, which we're seeing, of anxiety, depression, and so on? What can you help in terms of things which could be tried out, which on the boundaries of physical design, service design, social interaction design, which actually might do something about that, ideally formed into experiments where there is some metric. And next week, actually, I'm publishing quite a detailed proposal. I'll be working on a new metrics around mental health in organizations. And it's a field where there's been surprisingly little innovation. There, of course, are experts and academics, and there is some knowledge, but very little that I'm aware of has come from the design world, the arts world, and so on. Or often they're very small projects which aren't designed in a way they can be scaled and replicated because they don't have a strong enough evidence base or data approach. So that's the sort of space which I think is hugely important to, not just this year, 2021, but for the next 10 or 20 years, where the best brains should be innovating. And I showed that data from the World Happiness Survey. The presence of people you can turn to if you're in a crisis is one of the most important things for our human well-being, but there's almost no R&D on it, no design. The internet companies, which have spent billions, well, tens of billions on R&D since the mid-90s, even when there was clear evidence that those kind of social connections were deteriorating in the US, that became very clear by the mid-2000s, not one of them spent any serious money on innovating around how to address loneliness, isolation, lack of social support. They put all the money into new kinds of click-through advertising and stuff like that, and we're now paying the price. So I think some parts of business have really lost the plot on what matters and where they put their innovation. But I would also say, ask the creative minds at CSM and so on, issues not like climate change, but also mental health and social mutual support are the ones we really need much more work on in the next few years.
So yeah, very much agree with that. I do have two additional points to complement Geoff's thoughts on this. One is that I think one area for design and innovation is exactly on the side of method, and two concrete examples on this front. One is that if we look at, for instance, the ideas that emerged from the first Untitled year in terms of utopias, in terms of imaginations, I believe like a lot of that was about essentially two types of domains. One, which was essentially combinatory approach. So combining thinking on, for instance, commons theory into data sciences and data management. So a very typical situation in which new ideas emerge when you combine two different domains and spaces of thinking together, which is essentially something that facilitation and method can really solve and provide value in. And then the second is more conceptual. And I think on the conceptual side, I think there would most likely be a need and demand for design and innovation methods to be a bit more rigid in terms of providing us with ways forward. An example here is, for instance, Geoff referred into his presentation on the notion of universalism. And universalism basically provided us a groundwork of ideas back in the 20th century, from human rights into our welfare states and how we, for instance, deliver our services. So universal service delivery is fundamental in the Nordic model, for instance. But the question now is, if we have crises such as the mental health crisis, we talk about crises that are quite immaterial by nature. They are intangible. They're not something that most likely material service provision is able to solve. So it comes down to level of meaning. It comes down to level of dignity. It comes down to level of how we are perceived as human beings in the society. And I would argue that that is a conceptual challenge. And that is a challenge that can be answered, for instance, by having a bit of an understanding of the categories through which we essentially list people into society. And an example of an experiment that would be really great to see happening quite soon is that if we would basically remove the category of unemployed and instead have a category of a learner or a continuous learner, what would it mean on mental health? What would it mean for the sense of purpose and meaning for those individuals in our societies? But I would argue that there is that lack of method there in terms of how figuring out those conceptual configurations through which we could then initiate those experiments with. And that comes back to a lot of the methods that are taught in the design sciences and disciplines, but also on arts and culture more generally. And when we've been building up the program with the Untitled, we are still kind of hoping to get a bit more concrete methods and approaches through which we can get such outcomes. So that's one. And then the second one is essentially on how to ensure the institutional innovation. So the question that you posed earlier on ecosystems, I would focus my energy more. Instead of focusing on the grassroots level and bottom up, I would definitely put as much an equal amount of energy on ensuring that there is that institutional feedback loop. And that means working with quite nerdy topics with institutions that are quite rigid and stable, such as government departments or municipality budget departments or whatever those are, in order to ensure that there are those feedback mechanisms in place through which we can captivate and cultivate those innovations that are emerging in those ecosystems that you asked about. So those two, first one on the very kind of concrete level of method, and then the second one on institutional innovation and ensuring structures on that front.
Thank you. I'll actually tie this to another question. So when the Imaginary Crisis paper was just published in April, we were at the beginning when we were all grappling with the realization that COVID-19 is spreading all around the world and that we as individuals and even governments are now in a new territory. I think, Geoff, you once said in a talk that innovation happens fast during a crisis, but we are slow to innovate during normal times. Almost a year has passed. So how do you both think we have handled it? Have we moved fast enough? And what are examples of fast innovation you've seen in the past year that have mitigated some of the pervasive impact of COVID and you think we can still use?
So in many ways, the last 12 months has seen an extraordinary acceleration of innovation on so many fronts. From governments completely transforming how they use data and intelligence to, not in the UK, unfortunately, but elsewhere, to track outbreaks, the transformation of the school system to online in a matter matter of days, which for the last 30 years was impossible. The fact that we now take for granted you might get your main health diagnoses online by video. Again, that's a big innovation. The creation of new welfare systems. So furlough in the UK, but many other countries have almost invented new welfare states from scratch to keep family incomes going in the crisis. Reuse of buildings of all kinds, from thousands of railway carriages in India being used as testing centres to all the thinking now being done about reshaping city centres if the work doesn't come back. So in some ways, the crisis has been quite lively. The political sort of centre ground has shifted dramatically compared to a year ago. What Joe Biden is doing in the US is completely different from what Joe Biden would have done if he'd been elected a year before. He has a much more radical, he's spending far more money, taking far more risks than he would have done. And of course, you know, the British Conservative government has adopted a whole ream of what were Labour policies and approaches. So the land is shifting, and that's good. And in part, I think last spring, it was clear that the COVID crisis would be one of these moments which would create a demand for not just a return to the status quo, not just going back to where we were before. And so every politician adopted some kind of slogan like Build Back Better, as our government did. I still think, though, we haven't got enough supply. We haven't got the right ideas, and there's still some glaring gaps. The budget a week ago, for example, was an anti-climate change budget. You know, in terms of you look at the numbers, it was a budget designed to slow down action on climate. And there are many other examples of that kind where we just still don't quite have the right orchestration of imagination. And perhaps I just make sort of one comment on method, building on what Juha said. For me, what is key in all of this is constantly iterating between the macro and the micro. If you're doing something small scale, it may just be, you know, a new service or designing a product or a building, always try and think how that connects to the bigger systemic changes which are needed in the world. But equally, if you're trying to work on the systemic changes, unless you can show what that means in reality on a small scale now, you're probably just hot air. And often I think those two worlds, they sort of pass by without connecting. You have people making vast sweeping statements about systems change, but if you ask them, okay, what should we do tomorrow? They haven't got a clue. And then you've got lots of practitioners doing great work, but it adds up to less than the sum of its parts because it's not woven into really a vision of how the pieces fit together. So that's, for me, part of the design challenge, is how you can become, as it were, bilingual, as at ease in the very practical, pragmatic and immediate, and the very long-term and systemic. And that's a rare mindset, but I think it's really important, probably on MAs like yours, that is being cultivated in creative young people.
To build up on the last point, I definitely agree. I've said many times that if I think of our organization, there are two things that have made it distinctive. One is the capability to look at different sectors at the same time. And the second is exactly the capability to which Geoff was referring to in terms of moving in between macro and micro. And that's something that is, I would say, an essential and key capability when going forward, and definitely something for everyone participating in this call to take notice of. In terms to your question, I think there are like two sides of the coin. First is that we've seen successes in terms of imagination and innovation during the past 12 months. An example I see here in Finland is that, for instance, the way our educational system transformed, this is again an example that many countries have seen, but it was astonishingly quick. And our education system here is decentralized. There's a strong autonomy for individual teachers, yet there's a very well created national backbone in terms of standards, in terms of what should be taught. So that combination of factors, attributes, essentially meant that the system transformed really, really rapidly. And I think what we need to do is to analyze and understand which are such attributes in this crisis that enabled imagination and change rapidly. And yet at the same time, what we need to do in tandem is to realize that then on a broader scale, our systems are still based on very different metaphors, very structured, very verticalized, very rigid, in which many imaginations are quite impossible. And now what I do see is a public debate, public demand, public pressure coming to change those systems on a very fundamental level, almost on the level of metaphor to an extent. And what we need to do is fight to ensure that that pressure stays in order for us as societies, but also for our decision makers to make those decisions needed in order for our basic structures and governance mechanisms to be suitable for the emerging crises looming in the horizon that are much, much more significant than the COVID crisis we've seen in the past 12 months.
Thank you both for this thought-provoking conversation. Now we will turn to the questions our audience submitted. Among one of the many questions we have here is one by our program co-director of the Culture and Enterprise Department, Alison Green. Juha, can you give an example of a radical experiment? I'm interested about the convergence of these two words together and what they mean in practice.
Sure, I like the combination of those two words as well. Well, what I said before, for instance, on an experiment, this is a speculative experiment in which we basically changed the category of unemployed into a category of a continuous learner. I think that would be a really, really interesting radical experiment that could be done. It wouldn't be easy. It would require quite a bit of process design. And of course, it wouldn't be 100% correct due to the fact that there's so many social constructs when we go to that level, but it would be really, really interesting. A lot of people said at the time in which the universal basic income experiment was launched nationally that that's a radical one. We know now that the experiment itself was not radical, but at the point and in the context it was, and the only thing that required was that capability to launch the experiment. So that would be another one. So it depends a lot on the context, of course. I think the experiment I also illustrated, which is a concrete experiment with our service union, is an interesting one, because if we take the notion of collective bargaining power, and instead of using to bargain on individual and collective salaries and rights in terms of the employment contracts, but on Earth and on climate targets, I think that is something that is quite radical, because it takes one of the most foundational capabilities built in the industrial society to essentially deal with the social tensions into something that could solve the tensions and challenges of the future. I think that is something that is quite interesting, and I very, very much hope that we can translate that into something that also has tangible outcomes that are measurable.
Thank you, Juha. And a question for Geoff. We design products and services which results in cultures. Have you considered, and if so, what are prospects of directly designing cultures with anticipated positive effects for positive social changes?
Well, in a way, I'd hope all design does that. Everything around us is our culture. And as I said earlier, the design of homes, of objects and services to improve mental well-being seems to me one of the great coming topics. And a lot of designs have probably worsened mental well-being, not just digital service design methods increasing anxiety, compulsive behaviors and so on, but probably some aspects of urban physical design as well. So that seems to me a good space. The question just above it, which I just wanted to answer, which one on greed, I think that's a really interesting one. Because I think sometimes what is really hard to design are social norms, and yet social norms are what are so powerful in actually shaping our society. Is it normal that you get to know your neighbor, look out for them if they're in need, or do you just assume that's someone else's job? And I think one of the norms of today, which I think may look really strange in a generation's time, is that we think it's acceptable for the very rich to own 5, 10, 20 homes and not use them most of the time. It's acceptable to own 5, 10, cars and not use them most of the time. The extraordinary waste built into one side of capitalism is just taken for granted as a fact and is a symptom of greed. And that's one thing where I would love to see creative thinking. How could we shift norms? So it became really embarrassing to be quite so wasteful in your lifestyle. People who are advocates of capitalism in some ways correctly say it can be very good at driving efficiency, but this is one way in which it drives the most extraordinary profligate inefficiency. So again, I'm slightly throwing that question back to you, but I think that's a really good topic for creative design thinking.
May I just continue on this a bit, because this is actually a discussion that we were having at the Untitled community. And the discussion was exactly about a creed and whether there would be an opportunity to change from the paradigm of scarcity into a paradigm of abundance, and whether that could happen by experimenting with, for instance, universal basic services or even universal basic assets. So essentially enabling ownership or services to the extent in which we would have a change of norm from the mode of scarcity, in which you compete, in which you try to increase efficiency, in the mode of abundance. And whether this change in itself could be powerful enough for us as humankind not to be pursuing increase of wealth that is so wasteful, not just for the planet, but also to communities. So this is actually a very concrete example of a discussion through which now much more work is needed in order to formulate an utopian future, and even more to formulate a radical experiment. So at least I'm not saying that any of this should be easy, it should be really hard, but it requires that work and community and engagement in order for us to be able to answer questions such as exactly this one.
And just 30 seconds more on that, if you don't mind. So a few years ago, I published quite a detailed proposal on how to design into tax a way of operationalizing what I was talking about, where essentially, if you were very rich, over a certain amount of money, you'd be allowed to spend it on philanthropy and get glory for that, to have your name on it, like the Gates Foundation, but you wouldn't be able to spend it on ever more homes and cars and so on. Not a single economist was even willing to discuss that proposal. I talked to many of them, grand professors of economics in London and elsewhere. They weren't even willing to engage in a conversation about these more radical options, which at the moment are, I admit, beyond the sort of political norm. But again, my hope is in a generational term, it will seem obvious. You don't allow quite such extraordinary waste to be built in unnecessarily into your economic system. And my proposal still gave quite strong incentives for people to become rich because they could get glory and recognition, but just not to do it in a very wasteful way. So we have big problems in some of our disciplines like economics, which are on the one hand not using any methods from design, arts, creativity at all. There's a real myopia there, and actually block off some of the more radical debates we should be having.
A question from Sandra. Can renewal come from small steps rather than radical ones? Who would like to take that?
There's a fascinating actually blog post just a couple of days ago on reminding of some research on this. I don't know if I can compress this into 1 minute. So in some ways, there's sort of two opposite viewpoints which have been around for 200 years. One is that all change should be incremental, small steps, organic. This was the view of Edmund Burke, Jane Jacobs in relation to cities, James Scott, some of you may know, wrote a book, Seeing Like a State. And they're against grand designs, big projects, top-down radicalism, and say everything should be organic and incremental. And there's another view which says actually the barriers to progress are so powerful, unless you really smash through them, do things quite aggressively, change doesn't come. And about 10 years ago, there was a very detailed study 200 years ago, looking 200 years ago, when the French had basically conquered some parts of Europe and not others. And in the ones they conquered, they imposed Napoleonic law, a whole series of reforms were imposed from outside. And in others, that didn't happen. And so the question to anyone in this audience, okay, 50 years later, which ones were more prosperous, more democratic, more free? And we each have our assumptions on that. The punchline is the ones where change was imposed radically were doing much better than those which weren't. So although I'm instinctively quite attuned to the Jane Jacobs kind of way of thinking, of things being organic and etc., it's not quite as simple as that. Sometimes you do need the more radical, bolder, big designs to overcome the power of small c conservatism and vested interests, which otherwise crush necessary change.
If I may build on this, because it's a very, very interesting question, and to an extent, I would argue that is a false dichotomy. And I give an example. We've recently worked with our Prime Minister's office on a concept called humble government. So it's based on Professor Charles Staples' theory on experimentalist governance at Columbia Law, which is really interesting. It's a theory in terms of how can we govern complex societal challenges such as the climate crisis, but also a variety of crises or situations, for instance, on land use or water use and stuff like that. And essentially the idea there is that we are trying to set up a method and approach in which the government can state a radical goal, radical future. For instance, our government stated the goal of zero carbon economy in Finland by 2035, which to the standard of our industry right now is quite radical, but enable a mechanism through which incrementally and through experiments, we can actually get there. So then some of those experiments most likely are more radical, but some are incremental. So what is lacking is the method in between, radical vision and experiments and initiatives in order for us to get there. And again, this comes back to the Untitled philosophy as well. You need both. You need to have that radical vision, as Geoff said, and occasionally that is something that is absolutely needed, but you also need to be able to get those tangible steps. You need to illustrate the future and the utopia, yet illustrate that there is a way getting there as well. Otherwise, it might feel irrelevant.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Geoff.
On the digital being question. So one of the questions in the chat is on, what is all this online stuff which we're doing at this very moment doing to our digital being? And the short answer is, I don't know. Obviously, the last year, we've seen a huge real life experiment in online education, online tutoring, all sorts of things. And I'm just beginning with the Public Policy Observatory, a big assessment of what are we learning from this and what should we take forward into next year when learning can be more face-to-face. And I think it will be quite a complicated pattern. Some things will have improved, some things will have worsened, and generalizations will be wrong. But my guess is overall, we probably are seeing an irreversible shift to a digital being in work, in learning, in health, in entertainment, but we will need to compensate by even more reinforcing our non-digital beings through taking care of our bodies, our lived-in physical environment, but also what's happening in many cities with the idea of the 15-minute neighborhood that you try and create around within 15 minutes walk as many as possible of the things you need for life. In some ways, that's an idea which only makes sense in a digital era because it's trying to strengthen a non-digital being to make up for probably the unavoidable digitization of ourselves. But I don't really know, but it's a great question.
Thank you. Ida, one of our amazing associate lecturers, has a question. Would you consider transition to online education, provision of health services, etc., as an example of innovation in a crisis, or merely adaptive behavior with diminished quality of service interactions?
Well, in a way, that's where it did happen as a response to necessity and a crisis rather than as deliberate innovation. But I think we'll, in the long run, believe our education and health systems did in the last 12 months a lot of experiment they probably should have done over the previous 20 or 30 years. So just take interacting with your doctor, your GP online. It's long seemed to me that was kind of obvious that's what should happen. And I don't think we'll ever go back because that improves the quality of your interaction for most everyday things rather than having to, traipse over to their surgery, wait in a queue, etc., etc. Similarly on online education, I think we will see hybrids, more use of online for some things, but use of the face-to-face in more intensive ways for other things like discussion, project working, teamwork, etc. So I was rejecting the premise of the question. Yes, this has been forced of necessity, but what comes out of it will be probably, I hope, significant improvements in how many services are run and a smarter mix of the online and offline.
Juha?
Just because now we're all talking about the premises, so there was a question by Iñaki about whether social networks and social platforms foster social imagination. I think it's a really interesting question because I would say that, again, here I would come back to the premise. Right now they don't. This would be a very kind of simplistic way of answering due to the algorithms and how those are designed on social platforms, but they can. And this is exactly the point there. So we shouldn't think of the institutions or technologies such as the social platforms that we have right now through the lens in which we cannot control them or cannot essentially change how they behave. And from my perspective, and this is something we'll be putting out a paper quite shortly, essentially what a social platform is a governance mechanism. It is a way to change behaviors and orchestrate behaviors and interactions. And if we would think of it as such, we would basically perhaps empower ourselves to design social platforms that would then actually foster social imagination instead of create filter bubbles through which we won't connect, engage, or really think of futures worth living in.
Thank you, Juha. And I have two questions from two of our most talented students, Prang and Molly. So the question is, why is it a challenge for a city or a government to really focus on the people when they are the most important part of society? So how could we imagine for collectives while maintaining individualism? And then how do you propose we can involve non-technical participants, like citizens, into quite technical processes, such as backcasting? Can you reference a successful example, please?
Well, the city is actually the ideal unit to do this sort of work. And many cities at different times have attempted, usually driven by a mayor or some kind of city leadership, to try and get the whole city to think 20, 30, 40 years into the future. What do we want it to look like physically? You know, do we build new roads or cover them up? What do we want to be happening to how we organize care? How do we make sure the air is clean? And so on. And these conversations, there are lots of methods for organizing these conversations at scale. They always have to have some mix of a bit of technical skill and non-technical. They don't work if they are only one or the other. It's bound to be a combination. And I think they're really good topics, going to the very final question on the chat, for young people to take part in, since they will obviously be the ones who are going to live in the city. I mean, I've run many sessions with school kids, and it's, you know, once you say, okay, what do you want your food system to be in 20 or 30 years time, you give them a few methods, they start thinking through alternatives. It's not difficult to do. It's just that usually people aren't given the license. And I think it's vital some of that license comes from the top. It has to be a political leader who says, I want us, you know, part of my almost accountability for being a mayor or a city leader is not just what I do in the present, fixing problems, making it work, but also what I do now to make sure my successor in 20 or 40 years time has you know, a good inheritance. We've really done the things which needed to be done for the long term. And I just wish more of that was being done now in our cities. I mean, London is a great example, which at various points, most recently about 12 years ago, had a big program of sort of shared envisioning, thinking about future challenges. And almost all of that has disappeared, sadly. Even though London is quite a young city, a very diverse city, a city with all sorts of options for the future, but the conversation just isn't happening, and certainly not in a remotely inclusive way.
Juha, I see you nodding. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, only thing I would like to add there is that I do see that as a space in which a lot of things will happen in the next few years and decades, because basically what we have now is a generation of politicians coming into politics and decision-making roles, in which I would say that there is already partially that type of a mentality there, having engaged through those social platforms and networks with a variety of different citizens and communities and groups. But then when they come into the public administration context, that context might not be the most easiest or inspirational in terms of pushing such an agenda forward. So I think that space in terms of having missions to change a part of our society, I think that would be actually quite a good bet. And I would bet that there's a lot of things happening there. There already are, but I would expect to see much more in the next few years.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. So question to Juha from Ramia. I wonder if you could explain more your idea of experimentation in relation to the idea of prototyping, a term used in design and design for policy. Can we imagine a financing mechanism that would desensitize greed, apathy, and selfishness?
Surprising end to the question. Hello, Ramya. So I would say that, well, a textbook answer most likely would be that in a pilot, you would have a premise of trying to know what you're expecting to get, whereas an experiment is more open-ended and more about learning. On a more abstract scope, I would say that an experiment is essentially something in which there's less control. So it is much more about unleashing an emancipating energy and into a question. So I would say that to me at least would be the key, and the reason at least why I refer to experimentation and experimentalism. The latter part I did not quite get, but perhaps I can find the question, or would you like to restate, Ghadah?
Sorry, you'd like me to repeat it again. So the second part. Can we imagine a financing mechanism that would desensitize greed, apathy, and selfishness?
De-incentivize greed and right. Well, sure. And I think like the previous answer on the, well, like what Geoff said in terms of how assets can be converted through redistribution and taxation schemes partially was about this, and also the answer on moving from scarcity to abundance. So I think the key there is that it is more fundamental than a financial mechanism. It needs to happen on multiple different levels at the same time if you want to have a societal level change in the social norm on that question, because it is fairly big, but it does require both those mechanisms in terms of redistribution, but also in terms of how we perceive our society around us. But I guess that would be a topic for the next 1.5 hours.
Thank you, Juha. And a final question. How can we shift the cultural conversation away from overconsumption and never-ending growth towards organizations and businesses caring more about the social and ecological impact over financial?
Well, as I said, the Pope may be an ally in that respect. I think in historical terms, capitalism hasn't always been purely financially obsessed. It's a relatively brief period when it was assumed that companies' only job was to maximize financial returns and profits. That is, in historical terms, very unusual. And returning to a concern for ethics, a concern for social impacts, a concern for environmental impacts is, I think, in some ways takes us closer to the norms of human history. It has to be driven by the investors, and any of you who have any assets or a pension or an insurance, you should be pressuring the guardians of your capital to be going further in demanding of companies that they aren't just achieving financial returns. As employees, you have a big impact. We've seen this in the last few years on companies like Google. Probably more influence on their social behaviors come from within, from employees, than has come from anywhere else, and especially younger employees with values. As consumers, we can choose to boycott or not buy things. So cultures change in complex ways, and the cultures of business will be influenced by all of those forces. I think our biggest danger now is there'll be a rhetoric of piety. Every business will say, yes, we're wonderfully green and socially conscious and so on, but actually their actions will be very different. So it's vital to keep an eye on what's actually being done. Look at the numbers, don't just accept the PR statements, because a lot of them are not very accurate.
Just to complement, I absolutely agree with everything Geoff said on this. It's 50 years since Friedman published the article at New York Times, basically stating that the only social responsibility of corporates is to maximize profits. And in addition to everything Geoff said, I think the layer of heuristics in terms of what those corporations are that do something else other than legal entities. And an example here is that we work with a company called Ylva here in Finland. And essentially what we did with them was that they took a position of corporate activist. And by being a corporate activist, they launched a series of initiatives. Most concrete and tangible was that they banned beef in all of their restaurants in Helsinki metropolitan area. And by banning beef, of course, you get quite immediate impact in terms of your CO2 emissions. And key there to me was to be able to have a category of corporate activists in order for those employees also to identify and create their identities in that context. And I think that's something that, in complement to what Geoff said, is lacking. We need to have those heuristics. We need to be able to also say which those companies are that have a stronger societal and social responsibility, other than through only measurements. And I think that those categories need to be created. It's something that we're working with actually quite right now. And I think there will be quite a bit of demand from the private sector side to take those new categories into action as well.
Thank you, Juha and Geoff. Well, I think we ran out of time for this event, but there is still time and hope for all of us to utilize our social imagination. I just want to add that the mission of the Untitled community strongly resonates with the strategic objectives of UIL and CSM generally, and with the values of our MA Innovation Management community in particular. We want this event to mark the beginning of a dynamic collaborative relationship rather than being a one-off dialogue. So let's keep the conversation going. I'd like to thank our speakers today. Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion. I would also like to thank the MAME and CSM team for their hard work in making this event happen. I hope you've enjoyed our session, and I invite you to check our webpage, MA Innovation Management, for our open days and future exciting events that we have planned. That's it from us today. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.